the aims very quickly. What we want you to do is understand it. You know, these consultations can sometimes seem quite complex and overwhelming, and certainly this one has a lot of questions in it. So we'll look at that, that whole process of how people can engage. Is, there is, there are ways of engaging without having to read every single document and answer every single question. We're looking to discuss the key aspects of the curriculum and assessment process that are particularly relevant for us. And then ultimately what we really want to achieve with this and some of the other things that the DSA have put together is we really want as many, whether you're part of a local group, family, individuals, parents, to be feeding into the curriculum assessment review call for evidence and strengthening that voice, highlighting the issues that really make a difference for our learners. Right, so let me stop sharing. What we'll do is, in terms of conversations and things, so Gary and Philippa will give presentations. You can put some questions in the chat, or put your hands up once they've finished their presentations, and we'll have time for discussions with both of them. Right, over to you, Gary.
Chris, thanks so much for the invitation here. It's an absolute joy to be here with you all. Thank you. I'm really excited about hearing from Philippa, and also from all of you, in the webinar about your views on these things, your questions. I want to be as helpful as I can be in terms of answering any questions that you might have. I'm going to sort of start. Sorry, before I say that, my sort of a really great outcome for me would be that you and people would consider filling in this call for evidence by the end of the webinar. You decide this is a good thing to do before the 22nd of November. No, that's not just a numbers game for me about how many we can get, of these filled in. But the thing for me, if there are thousands of these documents, these call for evidences being filled in throughout the country, the more people fill it in who care particularly and know particularly what changes are needed to support our pupils with SEND in our schools, the stronger that voice will come across there. I'm really impressed so far with the sort of centrality of SEND to all these conversations about curriculum and assessment. It feels like, okay, we know that the education system needs to change for all pupils, but my goodness, it really needs to change for pupils with SEND. And that's how I feel about it. But it's increasingly what I'm hearing from others and sensing from others. And yes, change for all, but really change for those pupils. So the stronger that voice comes through in the call for evidence, the more likely the right change is to happen, as I see it. So I'm going to share some slides, as we've said, but I think there's something that becomes a bit impersonal the second you share a slide. So I will do that, but I'll just talk for a minute first. I hope no one minds. Happy to be interrupted as much as is helpful. And I'll certainly leave time afterwards for questions, answers, reflections, that kind of thing. About this curriculum and assessment review, probably a bit of context is helpful. It was in the Labour's manifesto that they would review curriculum and assessment in this country. And so when they got elected, they asked this person, Becky Francis, who leads the EEF, leads the What Works Centre for Education, the kind of research evidence body nationally for education. They asked her if she would lead this process for a year of this curriculum and assessment review. Becky invited 11 people to be part of the panel supporting her, and I'm one of them. And as Chris has said there, everyone on that panel cares a great deal about the inclusion of pupils with SEND and has something to say and some very informed opinions about that, and a great desire to get that right. But I'm the one with SEND in my job title, I suppose. So that is kind of, it's facing me, but it's an open door, certainly, for the change that might be needed. I want to sort of reassure people that I'm taking that job incredibly. It's not a job; it's a sort of some meetings I go to, but taking it incredibly seriously because I see it as such a great opportunity to change things. Now, I went into this process thinking curriculum and assessment. How high or lower are they on the list of things that we need to change in the system? Look at the difficult time that people get around EHCPs, around getting funding, resource, specialist assessment, all those kind of things. Curriculum assessment is important, but what about all that? But the more conversations I have and the more I sort of think about this and in meetings about this, is actually if you get curriculum right, if you study things that feel relevant and that can be taught at the right pace because they're not overfilled, if you can assess kids in ways that feel meaningful, positive, realistic and purposeful for children with SEND, then actually, again, some of that anxiety around school attendance and lessons a bit if you get curriculum and assessment right, if you get school accountability right, so if you assess schools on the right things, not necessarily on what percentage of them, of the kids, are at age-related expectations when they're 11 years old, or what percentage, or how they do in a fixed set of quite narrow qualifications that have been approved by the DfE for when they're 16. If you change those measures, schools can find it easier to go to a child, for a child who might have SEND, might have Down syndrome, might have something else. Let's make always the right decisions for that child, for those children and young people, rather than to fulfill an accountability measure that might actually not be the best thing for that child. So the more I reflect on curriculum assessment and the accountability measure schools are held to account against, the more I feel like this is absolutely vital and can make a wonderful difference, and won't solve every enormous challenge within the SEND system, but actually it can help a great deal alongside other things. Okay, that's probably enough of me talking without any sort of visual support there. So excuse me for a second while I just share my screen. So the curriculum and assessment review then. So Labour obviously said this is in our manifesto if we get in. The process started back in August. I had a phone call and, it's Becky, would you be involved? Very happy to. And then the panel was announced in September. We've been meeting fairly regularly. And then the big thing to happen was, I think towards the end of September, this call for evidence was put out. So this set of questions asking everyone who considers themselves a stakeholder what they think. And it's an 8-week process, I think. I'm certain it ends on the 22nd of November, so in 10 days' time, not long. Now, there's a terms of reference document about this, so I apologise if this gets unhelpfully technical at stages. I'll try not to, but I want to share a few things that were in the beginning document before any meetings have happened or any evidence has been asked or any views have been collected. In this document, it says we need to refresh the curriculum. So there's an acknowledgement even before a single view has been collected, that the curriculum isn't quite right, is not supporting future life and work. It's talking about workloads, how within any changes we make, we need to be really sensitive to teacher workloads. We know there's a recruitment and retention crisis in teaching. We know that teaching really needs to remain attractive and that teachers' workload is crazy. So actually that needs to be managed. We know before a single view is collected, this is, by the way, pasted from the DfE document, these terms of reference around the curriculum and assessment review, to consider the overall volume of assessment. So we know they're already saying there's too much assessment. We're assessing too much. They're already alluding to breadth isn't quite right. If you are, for example, only assessing kids aged 11 on reading, writing and maths, and if you're a head teacher where people are saying, well, is your school really great or not so great? Then actually you are going to, do a bit less of art and PE or life skills or personal development, or you are going to do less of those things because the headline figure that comes out in July is at what percentage of your kids were where they should be in reading, writing and maths, without paying attention to progress, without paying attention to how they've done as artists, as sports people, in terms of their personal development in relation to life skills, etc. So it's saying there's a problem there. It's saying that we want a broad curriculum. It specifically mentions more music, art, sport, and drama and vocational subjects. So of course, that's not just a SEND specific thing, but many of our young people who might struggle in some of those more traditional academic areas, which isn't all pupils with SEND, but is some, may particularly benefit from schools being sort of given the freedom to do more music, art, sport, drama, vocational subjects. And it talks about essential knowledge and skills to allow them to adapt and thrive in the world and workplace of the future. So I think where people have talked in education endlessly about a knowledge-rich curriculum, an appreciation that and if I think about what do parents want, it's not particularly knowledge at the top of their list. When I speak to parents, they're saying we want our children to have the skills to be able to get a job, to live independently, to be happy in themselves, to have friendships, as well as, of course, to have loads of knowledge in their brain. So that creates a balance there. So that could change a few things, maybe. And there's a few things here that are more relevant to, and some of you may be education professionals as well as here as family members, but it may be that at various stages of education, children are learning curricula that aren't overstuffed, where teachers can go a bit more slowly, and that will support many of our pupils with SEND. That maybe more children are able to take up creative vocational subjects age 16 or age 18 and be assessed on those, and the school can it can count for the school's figures, if you like. It may be that that the curriculum becomes a bit more broad at Key Stage 4. With if we, if we think at the moment schools are incentivized for as many children as possible to do English, math, science, or humanities, and a language. If that changes, maybe schools can help put their children on courses they're really interested in. Um, and then for pupils to ascend, maybe then the curriculum slows down a bit, and that supports pupils to ascend. Maybe schools are judged about in ways that mean that when they're inclusive, they're not punished for doing so. And at the moment, the way we judge schools, you could strongly argue that they're punished for being inclusive. There's resits at post 16 for English and maths if you don't get a grade 4 when you are 16. So again, if that changes, maybe that's a more positive experience than children doing resits that they might not be too motivated for. It might be that with the changes, if this comes through strongly enough in the call for evidence, that actually life skills, oracy, digital skills, what is it that families really want their children to go to school and learn about? Financial literacy is coming up quite a lot, by the way, from the teacher feedback particularly, and the parents' feedback actually. We want our children to be financially literate by the time they leave school. It might mean that pupils can benefit from greater choice, and as such, and for other reasons, perhaps fewer children will send or sort of be feeling like the education system isn't quite for them. So what I'm hearing so far by the way, just to convince people if needed that, I'm taking this seriously. I've met with the SEC that was mentioned in the context of Philippa earlier, the Special Education Consortium. I'm meeting with NASON and all the whole school SEND region leads, with the NDTI, with the National Association of Special Schools, with the National Special School Practitioners Organisation, with SOSSEN or SOS-SEN that some of you might know, who are working with families, and with Special Needs Jungle. And one I've written down there, who's that? Anyway, can't remember who that is. But taking this seriously, trying to engage as many stakeholders as possible. So what I'm hearing is that what our accountability system drives is not always what families want. Actually, there's a difference there between what families want and what schools are prioritizing. What I'm hearing is people that school practitioners are really interested in those accountability measures, feeling they are punished for being inclusive. That then, second to that, in terms of importance, they feel like assessments need changing. And third to that is we need to change our curricula to make sure the right things are taught at the right pace. I'm hearing from a wide range of people that pupils with SEND are the cohort who we need to make changes for the most. There's too much assessing kids, and that those assessments feel really high stakes for children, and we put them through a lot of anxiety that they don't need, that isn't helpful. I'm hearing from primary about clamour for teacher assessment rather than putting kids through SATs for all or some pupils, make it based on teacher assessment. Now, I showed a slide earlier about teacher workload, so that might be an issue that runs contrary to that, but it's what I'm hearing. And also there are potentially unintended consequences of anything almost. So you could say, for example, let's do smaller modular exams when children are in year 10 and year 11 instead of big end of 2-year exams. Yeah, okay, but then teachers can end up teaching endlessly to the test instead of teaching for teaching's sake and for learning's sake. We could say you do more coursework instead of end of sort of course exams. But coursework, the evidence from COVID suggests that more coursework favours those who are from wealthier backgrounds, where the support at home might be different, or the access to tutors might be different. It also suggests that coursework adds to teacher workload more than exams. So there's trade-offs there to be thinking about. One idea might be for kids with an EHCP, don't include them in what schools are judged on. But then are you sort of lowering the bar around, are you lowering schools' expectations around what they should be seeking, those high ambitions for those children with SEND? So there's trade-offs of almost anything, and that's kind of just worth flagging, I think. I'll just talk about this call for evidence, and I'll stop talking in sort of probably 4 minutes or so. So picked out 3 questions here. I won't talk over them for a minute. I'll leave them there just for sort of 20, 30 seconds. So I've just picked out 3 questions there out of the 54 questions. So that's the thing to be honest about, is it's a very long consultation. There's a QR code to the web page there. If I what I might do in a moment, we'll do some questions. Then if it's helpful, I can share my whole screen and just show you the call for evidence sort of web page, if that's helpful. 54 questions, but there is an easy read version. So first thing about that is just answer the questions you want. You're allowed to leave them all blank. I mean, you're allowed to. It lets you skip while leaving them blank. You might just choose those 3 that talk about SEND particularly. You might think I've got, as Chris mentioned, a child in secondary, so I'll just refer to the ones that are about secondary education. It's totally up to you. Even if you did 3 or 4 questions, I'd be enormously grateful. It would help to add to that picture nationally of what people want. It would there is an easy read version on there as well. So if you want to just go for reasons of time or access or language or whatever to go, I'm going to fill in the easy read version. It's on the same web page where that QR code takes you to, and I can drop the link into the chat or into an email shortly. That is much shorter, bit visual, reduction of language, fewer questions, and means you can fill it in quicker. But it needs to be emailed rather than being through the web page, which is not perfect. And then there is a tool I'll put through onto the chat as well, which has been developed to help teachers or perhaps parents as well. It's designed for teachers. Seek the views of a class of children they're working with, but you might use that or the easy read version to very much work with your children or children, groups of children you work with, to be able to go, children, young people, what do you think? Because you are there's no more important stakeholder in this than our children and young people. So my request, my hopes, that you help me to advocate well for pupils with SEND and their families, so that you help me do a good job by giving your views through the call for evidence and telling me some of those views today. My hope is that you support as many stakeholders as possible to engage with the call for evidence, yourselves, your own children, young people, but also those networks that you're in, perhaps. And that today's part of an ongoing discussion, that if there are things you want me to come back and hear fresh views on or give an update on, that, capacity, as long as I can, within other bits of work I have on, if I can, I'd really love to be invited back and either give an update or listen more, whatever's helpful. In the spirit of listening more, by the way, my Twitter handle and my email address are there. If that's sort of, something that people want to follow up, really happy to. I wonder if the Down Syndrome Association will be submitting a response as an organization. Obviously, if that is the case, that you're emailing in your own sort of, we represent this amount of people and this is our views, I'd love to be CC'd in that email, so it just makes doubly sure that it gets to me as well. I think probably sensible for me to stop sharing there to see if there are. I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat, sorry, I couldn't while I was sharing my screen. And there's some links and things. Right, yeah, thanks, Chris. So I'll sort of stop talking now and happy to take. You might have questions. I'm very happy to answer any question or at least find the answer if I need to. But equally, you might not have a question, but people might just have the education system's awful and I want to tell you about it. And I'm really happy just to listen to those things as well. So Chris, I'll hand back over to you, I guess, for a sort of bit of sharing that or working out how that might happen.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. Yes, put your hands up, put a question in the chat or a comment. And yes, we will be sending around links. This will be, obviously, as you know, this will be recorded. We'll send around the slides that I presume Gary and Philippa are happy for us to share. We'll be sending around all the links that have been mentioned. There's already a couple of DCP have done a good blog on the whole picture as well in terms of SEN and things like that. And yes, Gary, will definitely be taking you up on your offer of further engagement, because obviously this is the first stage, as you've said, of a big review. It's not all done and dusted after this call for evidence.
Yeah, and Chris, while perhaps a couple of those questions are coming in, I see when they're ready, but I didn't really talk about the timeline. I'll just do that quickly if that's all right. So it started a couple of months ago in September. The call for evidence is now until later this month, the 22nd, 10 days time. And then the first initial recommendations will be the pieces of paper say early spring. So for me, that probably means February. And then that process of ongoing engagement continues. So I'll be speaking to lots more people from the SEND sector once we have a kind of initial recommendations to go, all right, does that go far enough? Have we missed something entirely here? Is that going to help pupils with SEND in the way that we think it might? And then the final recommendations to be in, I think it says early autumn. I would predict September 25, because to give school leaders a full year before those changes are implemented. So if the curriculum is changing, the national curriculum will change. So to give people a full year to look at their resources and things they do and things they teach and to prepare, which is the right thing, I think. So we're looking at changes here from September 26, or where they can be made earlier, then they should be made earlier. But generally, to give school leaders a full year of a process here of finding out and writing stuff, and then a full year to get those changes, which is frustratingly long for some. For others, they'll go to do it well. It takes time, and that's understandable. So, either way. And finally here, before I sort of do shut up, just I'm not representing formally the views of the panel or the views of the Department for Education here. I'm speaking to you openly and honestly, and I hope that you're taking that in that spirit, that, you know, that's kind of what I'm sharing with you today. So what I'm sharing is very much my feelings, very much things that I think are being taken very well, but not kind of, you know, not the agreed this is what's happening, you know, because we're still finding out, still need to get all those call for evidence responses in. All right, thanks.
Great. Well, serendipitously, you answered the first question that came into the chat, which just as you started speaking was, do you know what the process is for analyzing
Oh yeah.
responses and timescales? So
Yeah,
that's
so I'll say a bit
that
more
covered.
about the timescales. I sort of covered a bit, but the analyzing responses. All I know is it's been done by an external company. Um, the sort of the only prediction I've heard is 20 to 30,000 of these being filled in, which is quite an undertaking. And you'll see none of the questions are, you know, yes, no, or, you know, pick one of these four boxes. They're all qualitative. You know, write your sentences in. So there's an organization that will have to do it quite quickly because there's, you know, people are impatient rightly for change. There's from the November the 22nd, the responses need, you know, the initial recommendations going out in, let's say, February. That's a short window of time to take in 20,000 responses. So there's an external company have you know won the tender to be able to do that. I don't know, I'm not inside more than that about their methods there, but if it's helpful, I can try to be.
Great. We've still got a few minutes before Philippa's bit. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? I mean, now just while we're waiting, then Gary, here's one from me. How do you see the curriculum and assessment review sitting alongside some of the unknown, but some of the planned, people are saying, reforms to the SEND system that this, I'll call them a new government, are planning to undertake?
Yeah, I think so. So you know, I'm speaking to people who, some here who will know loads about education, and some who actually just want to just send their kids to school and sort of let education get on with being education. So I hope people will forgive me speaking to a mixed audience. So, and if I've befuddled anyone already, then I apologise and please let me know and I'll clarify things. So Bridget Phillipson, as our, you know, our education secretary, she made a speech last week to 1,600 school leaders, and she talked about, you know, send and inclusion, and schools going, no thanks, those kids aren't for us, that's got to end. Schools being uber competitive with each other, about league tables, that kind of uber competitive has got to end, because actually it's about children and being inclusive. Some people will know on the call that Ofsted are going, we need an inclusion criterion. So currently schools are judged on leadership and management, on personal development, a couple of other areas. But actually, we should have a fifth area, which is around inclusion. So there's sort of hope that Ofsted will start looking for the right things a bit more and not letting schools who aren't inclusive get these outstanding inspections that perhaps they don't deserve, because perhaps they're not outstanding for all pupils in their local community, only, you know, only some. So that's the first bit there. So sorry, Bridget Phillipson, Education Secretary, made this speech last week to 1,600 people from across the country, and she talked about that. Firstly, schools got to stop being competitive, got to be inclusive, mainstream inclusive schools being, you know, what needs to happen across the country. Not as an insult to the work of special schools, but I think as just a reality of, it's not just up to a few hundred schools to be inclusive and meet needs of kids, meet the needs of kids with complex needs. It's up to every single school in the country, which I think is the right message personally. She mentioned this curriculum and assessment review that I'm a part of, that we're talking about today, in relation to SEND. So she mentioned the curriculum assessment review twice. Once broadly, this is going to be a good thing, and once it's specifically going to help our pupils with SEND. Now, just a bit of reassurance here. I've met the, you know, senior person at the DFE who's involved in this wider work around SEND beyond the curriculum assessment review. So what it, you know, changes to whatever it is, EHCPs or schools, wider pieces of work beyond the curriculum, how teachers are trained, how TAs are recruited, all that sort of wider bits that will affect pupils with SEND. And have ongoing sort of, you know, conversations with those people beyond curriculum assessment. So I don't think anyone has a magic answer, by the way, and clearly there isn't one. Clearly, the answer to fixing this broken system is going to take many things all happening and being done well at the same time, and informed by the views of lots of people. But I think increasingly the dots are being joined, and that this isn't just happening. This is happening alongside changes to Ofsted, alongside other broader conversations around how we can upskill every single teacher, TA, head teacher, etc., in the country to be able to meet SEND needs in their local school wherever possible.
Great. And also your last comment is also linked to the next question, which
Yeah.
is there an expectation from Maggie that teacher training will become more specific for SEND within the curriculum and assessment review?
Yes. So yes and no. So not within the curriculum and assessment review, I suppose, because the purview of the curriculum assessment review is curriculum and assessment and the accountability measures of schools, including the qualifications that kids take or can take. So that's sort of one bit. But in that's useless on its own, as all these bits are useless on their own. Changes to your Ofsted is useless on its own. Just going, we're going to hold you to account more about inclusion. Yeah, but how are schools supported to be able to do that really well? So Maggie, it's a great point. There is certainly an expectation, like it's very much my view that there've been some steps to go, like when teachers are trained and in the early parts of their career, or when they're doing leadership qualifications, that SEND is more of a thing there. Even this bit here about early career teachers and initial teacher trainees, that's had a revamp to have SEND more running through it. I wasn't involved in that revamp. I only know it as a bit of paper, so don't, proofs in the pudding, I guess. But for those early career teachers, what they will learn will change from, or what they have to be taught, will change from September 25 to have more of a focus on SEND. I don't know at the moment whether that goes far enough, but that move's already been sort of reviewed and outlined, and that's all on the line if people are interested in that. But the thing that's missing for me is that massive bit in the middle. It's all good supporting teachers at the beginning of the career, and or if they're sort of aiming to become a head teacher or other type of senior leader. What about this massive bulge of really wonderful, hardworking classroom and subject teachers across the country? We can't ignore their own development, and it's not enough just to go, we'll put on an inset day every so often. It's like, no, how do you give teachers the time? Because meeting the needs of pupils with SEND can take more time than meeting the needs of kids without SEND. And so how are we supporting teachers to have the time and professional support to do that? And by the way, I don't think anyone's got the answer for that yet, but the fact the question's being asked and acknowledged, I think is really good news. So steps in that direction, but no clear plan yet. But this will be useless unless teacher training is alongside it, Maggie.
Great, yeah, and we when we fed into other reviews which are looking at SEND teacher training, for us is always a big priority. Brilliant, thank you so much, Gary, for covering such a large amount of ground in a whistle-stop tour of the curriculum assessment review. As I said, we'll be sending lots of links that have been mentioned, slides and things like that round. So thank you very much. And now let me hand straight over to Philippa Stobbs, who'll be doing something similar, but looking at the substance of what our curriculum and assessment processes are.
Just check that you can see that, colleagues, before I get started. Can you see that all right, Chris?
All clear. Yeah, just need to do the slideshow itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks for inviting me. Thanks to you all for joining this discussion. And just really to echo what Gary has said, I think one of the most important things that you take away from today is a sense that actually you must contribute to this consultation, because there is nothing more important than ensuring that the broad frameworks that govern our schools and how they work are friendly towards children with SEN and disabilities. And for me, this is quite sort of fundamental to ensuring that. There are lots of things related to it, but this is really one of the most important things. Okay. So curriculum and assessment, and I just want to spend a bit of time thinking about what that is. And for me, it is the framework for what we decide we are going to teach our learners in our early years settings, schools, FE colleges. So I think how you visualize this framework is really quite important to me. So let's just have a little look at a couple of things here. First of all, I would just want to consider what Ofsted says about the curriculum, and then add a few personal reflections on that. So what Ofsted says is that the curriculum lies at the heart of education. It determines what learners will be able to go on to do by the by the time they finish that key stage of education. So I think ultimately, though, it's more than that. It is, if you like, it is the content of what we think we are going to teach and what we think children need to learn. And as such, it does reflect what we value. And I put "we" in quotation marks there because what one person values may be very different from what another person values. And I think the importance of the current review is that it is an attempt to restore a national framework that is more, which is valued by more than the current framework is valued. And there is a sense that the focus on content and the focus on, if you like, valuing those learners who come through the system and get into our top universities, that has set aside what we value for learners who are not learning at age-related expectations, which is a fairly arbitrary thing, but it undervalues the achievements of those children who are not going to make their mark academically. And I think that's the importance of the current review, that actually this brings together everyone, and therefore your contribution is all the more important, because if we don't secure a strong voice from parents of children with SEN and disabilities and from those learners themselves, then we are not really representing the full national voice, and we're not securing that understanding of this being a national articulation of what we value and what we think our children and young people need to learn. So again, I want to look to Ofsted for getting some kind of notion of the structure of the curriculum and the complexity of that. So Ofsted expects a curriculum that is broad, that is meaningful, that is aspirational, and builds towards the next stage and ultimately towards adulthood. Now, conceptually, that's quite a challenge. So for me, I have some images in my mind, and this image of a young person climbing up a ladder, if you like. Importantly, it has a breadth to it as well. This is not just a single track. There are bars either side. But there are some restrictions from this image. And if you like, the image I want to sort of convey is more complex than that. But I want to start with this image, which is about progress. It is climbing up the ladder, but it is also about the things that sit either side. So it is about breadth as well. And Ofsted expects that that content is structured and sequence and builds towards specified endpoints. That's important because we need to reflect what we think is the way in which children and young people develop and learn. So if we're not sequencing it, we're not actually ensuring that we have some understanding of what progress will look like. And that in turn would compromise our ambitions for children and young people, where we want them to get to, if you like. So I said I thought it's a bit more complex than sort of like the ladders on the gym wall. And of course, different content is structured in a different way, but I wanted to use this playground image to try and reflect something of the different nature of different parts of the curriculum, if you like. But within that idea about breadth and sequence and progression, I think we can anticipate that there are different sorts of structures in relation to different areas of learning. And this is one image, and here's another one. It's a climbing frame, different, but importantly, it's sort of three-dimensional. It's not a simple single ladder. So in relation to curriculum, is assessment something we should welcome, or is it something we by and large have poor experiences of and regard it as a foe? And I think the importance of assessment, if you like, at its heart, is that every teacher needs to understand where learners are within that curriculum. If they don't know where a learner is in that curriculum, then it's almost impossible for them to plan next steps in learning. So this means that assessment is absolutely essential to every teacher, every learner, because the teacher needs to understand where that child is in the curriculum. And that is a form of assessment. Understanding where a child is in that curriculum is important to planning their next steps. And there is really interesting research that shows that the most inclusive teachers are those who have a very detailed understanding of the curriculum. It is so detailed that they understand where every single child is within that curriculum. So I'm thinking of maths teachers and PE teachers and teachers of different subjects who understand their subject in sufficient detail to be able to include children with SEN and disabilities. And that, importantly, is where I want to make the link to teacher training. And I think at the moment, there is a tendency to see SEN and disability as something separate from the curriculum rather than built in. And I just want to mention a teacher, a wonderful head of maths in a large outer London secondary school, who herself modelled the importance of that understanding by providing, in the first instance, she took the what you might call the lowest group of mathematicians in that secondary school in order to demonstrate to her colleagues the importance of being able to teach all learners rather than just being able to get your A-level learners the best grades at the end of their school career. So her model of that also included the fact that she did provide some additional, where she spotted that a child was having difficulty grasping the next concept, she provided some additional support to that child in lunch breaks, just a little sessions after school and so forth, to make sure that she was taking responsibility for all those learners. And I think that's the essence of the curriculum and assessment review, is that we have to see it, as Gary's already said, we do need to see that linked to teacher training, but also linked to an articulation of what we value as a nation. The other element in that most inclusive teacher image is that teachers who have that detailed map of the curriculum in their head that they're working to on a daily basis, they keep that map under constant review. They notice when a child is learning differently, taking a different route to get to somewhere new within that curriculum, and thinking to themselves, hold on a minute, I didn't think that could happen, because this child, as far as I know, couldn't do what I think is a skill they needed before they could do this. But here is this child who's mastered this bit without having any evidence they'd mastered what I thought was an essential prior step. So keeping that curriculum map constantly under review is the other element for making sure that we have got teachers who are equipped to teach inclusively. So how do we use assessment? Is it for very different reasons? I've talked about the importance of teachers having that assessment in their mind, understanding where a child is within the curriculum. But we do also use it for understanding standards. We use it for governments to judge the nation internationally and schools within the nation, so for judging schools. And those ambitions, those uses of assessment can eventually come into conflict with that detailed understanding of assessment, curriculum and assessment that we need all our teachers to have. And I think Gary sort of covered that notion of the pulling the system in a direction which is not helpful to children who are learning differently or learning more slowly than their peers. So how do curriculum and assessment affect learners with SEN and disabilities? This is, as it were, the question that Chris gave us to think about. Well, I think the first thing to think about is really, are all our learners currently included? And the answer for me is no, they're not. And the pressure on schools and teachers of the current national curriculum, which, just a reminder, this changed in 2014. So at the same year that the Children and Families Act was introduced, and a lot of people have sort of been looking back and say, well, the problem is the Children and Families Act wasn't properly implemented. And I was working with a group of primary schools in 2014 when the 2014 curriculum was brought in, and they said to a person, they said, this curriculum makes it much, much more difficult for us to teach inclusively. It's not impossible, but it makes it so much more difficult. And that pressure on teachers, obviously, some teachers will persevere and make sure they continue to teach inclusively. But for a lot of teachers, it made that so difficult that in a sense they gave up. And a lot of our teaching and learning has been delegated to people who are not qualified teachers. And my example of that secondary maths teacher who realized the importance of making sure that she demonstrated her skills in including all children, I think is a sort of reminder to us that if it's more difficult to include all children, then actually teachers may more readily give up rather than taking the opposite route and seeing it as a challenge that they're determined to overcome. And I think my next point is, what happens if all learners are not included? Well, that teaching and learning in our system has been delegated very significantly to excellent committed staff, but who are not teachers, do not necessarily have those teaching skills that can help to steer children through. And there's some really interesting research that shows that when support assistants are working with children, they don't have the same focus on learning. They're more likely to be keen to see children complete a task and may help them in ways to achieve that, which don't support their learning. So I think we need to be aware that the narrowing of the curriculum content from 2014 has worked against the best interests of children with special educational needs and disabilities. So I think in a sense, I've answered the next question to some extent already. So how do teachers handle this? They tend to delegate. That is not every teacher, and there are absolutely wonderful teachers I've seen in action, wonderful schools who've ensured that they have kept that pathway for all learners by changing the breadth of the curriculum, including other things other than the very distinctive content of our current curriculum, to ensure that children are learning some of the social skills, some of the skills that are going to give them greater independence when they leave school, that broader range of skills, some of the skills in communication that are not necessarily that written reading and writing framework. And I think the impact for learners of all of this is that where they move out of that main framework, we are effectively throwing them at the mercy of teachers and schools, and whether or not those schools are committed to ensuring that all children there learn and make progress. And I think that's the problem for us nationally at the minute, that in effect we have made a commitment to an inclusive approach, a moral choice for school leaders, rather than something that we value nationally. And I think the impact for many families has been that they have seen their children not really included in learning, marginalized. They may well be valued as an individual member of the school, but they may well be marginalized from the educational content, because schools are struggling to include children in the curriculum and assessment system that we have at the minute. that's the problem that I think the current national curriculum poses for us. And so I hope that emphasizes the importance of all of us responding, and as Gary has encouraged us to do. So how could the review improve curriculum assessment for learners with SEN and disabilities? I think we need to ask of that review team that the size and shape of the new curriculum will be designed to include all learners. And all the messages we're hearing from the top of the office is that is precisely what this review is intended to improve. What would this look like? Well, I think it needs to include all those things that we know that are going to be essential to children and young people at the next stage of their progress through the education system, including the point where children and young people are actually leaving school. So it needs some of those skills which have been marginalized, some of those social skills, some of those independent skills, as well as the ability to reflect themselves on how they learn and to think about how they can support their own learning. So give them some agency in the learning process, I think, is really, really important. At the moment, there is a risk that we don't give them enough control over their own environment, that we don't engage with them sufficiently to make sure that we are responding to their articulation of their own learning needs. So I think it's really important there is something as well about how children learn and how we help them to think about how they learn. What's going to be in that new curriculum that isn't there at the minute? What do we feel about that? How would progress be measured in some of those areas that I've mentioned, such as the development of social skills, communication skills, that are not necessarily those written communication skills? How do we measure progress in some of those areas? And then crucially, how would teachers be trained to work with this new curriculum if it is significantly different? If we require from that maths teacher that more detailed understanding of the maths curriculum, that is quite a significant change for many teachers whose focus is on ensuring those A-level students get their university entrance. That is, if that is what that current curriculum values, how do we articulate to teachers coming into the system and teachers already in the system that we value more that all children should be able to learn from where they are and make progress, get that sense of achievement, and get that ability beyond school to feel they have a contribution to make to our national life. So I think, if you like, yes, there are some core questions about the curriculum and assessment system itself, but there are so many questions that we need to raise as part of this review to make sure that the impact of any changes is able to really affect the way that we include all learners in our education system. And just as a little bit of reflection, I worked with Nathan and Whole School Send on the development of a framework for thinking about how we might broaden the development of skills within obviously it's related to the 2014 curriculum, to think about how we bridge. In the early years, we have quite a broad curriculum, the early years foundation stage curriculum. And as we get to preparation for adulthood for young people with SEN and disabilities, again, we have a much broader curriculum, but in between the two, we have a very significant narrowing to a very tightly specified content and a very heavily content-dominated curriculum. So this was an attempt to think about some of the strands that need to sit alongside the national curriculum in order to broaden out our view of what's happening. So this sets out some of the things that we might want to think about, such as the development of independence, the development of children's voices in reflecting on what they're learning and what they think they need to learn, what they're finding difficult. So it's some of those things that I've mentioned, but this is a slightly more systematic attempt to get to an articulation of what that might look like. So that was what I wanted to cover, and I'm hoping on my screen doesn't show me what time I have left, and I fear I may have talked for too long, Chris, but hopefully that may prompt some thoughts from delegates who are with us today.
No, we've 6 minutes left, so almost entirely to script, Philippa, as always. So any questions? Again, hands up, put it in the chat. I mean, just while we're waiting, then let's go back to some of the ones that perhaps Gary might want to answer. And the one just came in from Gillian, which we haven't really touched on in detail yet, but to what extent will post-16 curriculum content be included in the review?
Yeah, I'll take that one if that's right. Firstly, just thanks enormously for Philippa. And by the way, I agree with every single word that came out of your mouth when you said that. And it was just lovely to hear you talk through it. So thank you so much. Julian's question about post-16. Yeah, the curriculum assessment review is from age 5 to 19. So it's key stage 1 to key stage 5. So the issues around the qualifications that colleges deliver, about the sort of slightly patchwork system of qualifications, as it feels like in post-16, about how only a third of children do A-levels. Did you know that? Only a third of children do A-levels. Yet we talk about it like it's the only thing, really, or like it's a real exception if someone doesn't do A-levels. So actually, is that sort of parity of different qualifications? Does it exist? How could it? The issues around English and math resits particularly is a sort of hot topic, I think. So very much 16 to 19. And if you feel particularly strongly about that, there are questions, as you'd imagine, in the call for evidence to seek views on that. Can I just rewind a second, Chris, as well, and just quickly discuss those previous two as well? So one thing I want to say in relation to is it Avia's question? Sorry, Avia, sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly, about the shift in education in a less stressful environment. So I think couple of sort of caveats first before I totally agree with you. One, within the terms of reference of this curriculum and assessment review, Becky talks about evolution, not revolution. So I think it's trying to manage expectations about basically schools will remain schools, and the things that schools do will continue to be the things that schools do. But actually, the less stressful environment might not mean that the national curriculum sort of reflects a Montessori curriculum. But what it might mean is that if it has, in less revolutionary ways, if there is less to cover in a year 4 English, reading and writing curriculum across the year, or in key stage 4, key stage 5, whatever year group, then actually a teacher can teach it in a way that doesn't feel like this to pupils who feel that whose pace needs to be a bit different for them, or for whom they more regularly need to recap some of the previous stuff before they move on to the new stuff. So some of that stress won't change. Some of the stress is about school environments, around the things teachers do, the behavior systems, things that, if I'm honest, without trying to get out of this at all, they're outside of the curriculum and assessment review. They're about wider changes there. It's not, I don't see a national system where it's, Montessori type curriculum, but reducing the assessment burden, reducing the amount that's in curricula, I think achieves some of that and is in the right direction. And then that one about class sizes, just a quick point for me to make is Becky is the CEO of this research evidence organization called the EEF, that some of you will know. She talks about being led by evidence. And so some of that is, what do tens of thousands of stakeholders think? Part of that is, what does research evidence say is true and is the right things to do? And within that, the evidence from the EEF around reducing class sizes is you've got to reduce it by quite a lot in order to see the benefit of it. If you reduce it from 30 to 27, 26, actually no particular evidence that suggests that's going to make a difference. If you reduce it to 15, then yeah, but again, that's unlikely to be realistic with funding pressures and things. So I don't think mainstream class sizes are on the agenda from what I hear. And there certainly isn't an explicit question about it in the call for evidence. But if it's something that you feel strongly about, I'd really strongly encourage you to put it in there, because where there are more children with SEND in our classrooms in every school than there was a few years ago, and more children with the HCPs than there were a few years ago, then class sizes is relevant. So really welcome those comments there. Thanks. I don't know, Philippa, there's things to add. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. Yes, I just wanted to add something about the first national curriculum that we ever invented. And I have to stick my hand up here and say that my teaching career was before we had a national curriculum. So I think one of the key things for me was that when we brought the national curriculum in, everyone welcomed it. When I was a new teacher, I realized that I was about to do something with my 6-year-old. I was about to do something that they'd already studied 3 times before at the age of 6. I mean, so it was really important, I felt, that we had an articulation of what we should be including nationally, rather than doing the Romans 3 times by the age of 6. Let's make sure we've got a breadth of an understanding, a shared understanding of what we want to value. But it was quite a few years later before the government at the time accepted that the starting point of that national curriculum was too high. And so we invented what were called the P scales, which actually only became compulsory to report against those P scales. And I think it's 2007. Those were then, as it were removed from the compulsory nature, but have passed into the sort of, if you like, the sort of subculture, and lots of schools have kind of reinvented the P scales because of the very high starting point of the national curriculum for children in year 1. And I think there is a backward pressure from the removal of those P scales, which removes that sense of any kind of ladder or way into the national curriculum. So I think one of the key things is to make sure that that framework starts at a point that reflects a wider range of children than just those who've got to that what's at the moment called a good level of development at the end of the early years foundation stage, at the end of reception year. If we don't make that starting point that is a reality for many children, then we're actually removing the framework, and we are actually generating, if you like, more children who we label as having a special educational need, but simply because our frameworks don't accommodate them. So it's just I think that starting point is possibly one that I haven't really made so far. I've talked about breadth and sequencing, but I think starting point is really, really important.
Great. We've just gone over, so I just want to thank both Gary and Philippa for coming. We couldn't have picked, to my mind, we couldn't have picked 2 better guests to guide us through where things are at in terms of the curriculum and assessment review. And you've both covered an incredible amount of ground in terms of pointing us to the right direction of the things to look at and the different aspects to consider. Thank you also to everyone who's taken the time to come to this, and we really hope you go away with some new ideas and some thoughts, or just some emphasis of what you were thinking already, and find a way of feeding in to the call for evidence, as Gary said, in whatever shape or form works for you and your experiences and your understanding at the moment. We will be sending around, there's lots of stuff to read, we know, but we'll send around some of the key links that have been discussed today. We'll get recording of this sent round as well, because I think, as Gary said, this is the call for evidence is a starting point. There's lots more to cover. There's lots more of ways that this kind of work dissects into some of the wider SEND discussions and things that are going to be happening over the next year or so. So thank you for contributing to this webinar, and I hope everyone has a very nice day. And we'll be, keep an eye out on the DSA website and our social media stuff for any additional information about this. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.